Today, you're about to hear a story of triumph and, at the same time, a terrible tragedy on Nanga Parbat. And we'll start, as usual, from a bit further back. Climber Tomasz Mackiewicz was born in 1975 in the Polish town of Żałoszyń. For the first 10 years of his life, he and his sister lived with their grandmother in this small town on the banks of the Warta River. It was there that his love for the wild first took root. At the age of 10, Tomasz moved with his parents to a larger city, and for him, it felt like a catastrophe. He deeply missed the countryside and the untamed nature, and it had a strong impact on him. His teenage years fell in the 1990s. As a teenager, he began inhaling glue and later became addicted to harder substances. Tomasz left home and started living on the streets. His sister Agnieszka found him and took him to a rehabilitation center. But 3 months later, he was back on the streets and using again. When Tomasz turned 18, he moved into a rehabilitation center where they practiced work therapy. For 2 years, he dug ditches, worked as a loader, and did construction work. And eventually, he managed to get clean. After moving to Warsaw, he met a woman named Joanna, whom he eventually married. It seemed that his life was finally starting to fall into place. At the same time, as his friends recall, he couldn't shake a feeling of emptiness and a lack of purpose. It was as if there was something inside him that constantly needed to be filled. He began trying his hand at all kinds of things. First, he enrolled at the University of Warsaw to study philosophy. But after a few months, he dropped out, deciding instead to hitchhike to India, where he would spend an entire year. It was there that Tomasz first saw the Himalayas and decided that he wanted to pursue high-altitude mountaineering. Tomasz married Joanna, and the two of them moved to Ireland. She found work as a child psychologist, while Tomasz worked as a mechanic. One day, in 2008, he met Marek Klonowski, a fellow Pole and a mountaineer. This is how Marek later recalled it. The first time we met was in Ireland, at a party in his garden. I was talking about how I had tried to climb Mount Logan in Canada solo, and Tomasz suddenly told me that next time he would go there with me. He threw himself enthusiastically into climbing the local rocks in Ireland. He climbed better than I did and learned everything on his own, without taking any courses or attending climbing schools, nothing at all. He clearly had a natural talent for it. And Tomasz Mackiewicz kept his promise. In May of 2008, the two Poles arrived in Canada to climb the mountain together with a boat, and then, practically from the summit, descend by raft all the way to the ocean. And that is exactly what they successfully did. For this 40-day expedition, they were awarded the Colossus Award. In 2009, Tomasz set out alone to climb Nanga Parbat Mount Mountaineering, a peak rising 7,010 meters, and he succeeded. After that, his attention turned to Nanga Parbat, one of the highest mountains on the planet, the 9th highest. It is also considered one of the most difficult 8,000ers to climb. But for some reason, Tomasz fell in love with this particular peak. He asked Marek to join him, not just for any climb, but specifically for a winter ascent. It was an extremely ambitious undertaking, as at that time there had been no successful winter ascents of the mountain. And it would have been a record. But in my view, neither Tomasz nor Marek had enough experience, equipment, or preparation for such an undertaking. Marek Klonowski later recalled that Nanga Parbat attracted them for several reasons, beyond its fame and the prospect of setting a record. First, it was relatively easy to reach. The approach to the Diamir face took only 2 days. Second, the climbing permit cost just $300. Simply put, it was cheap. And indeed, compared to permits for Everest, which cost tens of thousands of dollars, and with expeditions rarely costing less than $50,000, this was a prestigious peak at a very affordable price. The only problem was that climbers often referred to it as the Killer Mountain. Here is how Marek remembered it. Back then, to save money on porters, we carried most of the gear we would need on the mountain on our own backs to base camp. We didn't have proper equipment. Our jackets, tents, and sleeping bags were the kind used by tourists, not for winter expeditions on 8,000ers. We stood out so much from other expeditions that even the locals in the Pakistani village near base camp couldn't believe that we were actually planning to climb the mountain. And that time, they still failed to reach the summit. The following year, they returned again, with slightly better equipment and a bit more experience, and reached an altitude of 5,480 meters. But as you can imagine, that was still very far from the 8,000 mark. Another year later, Tomasz reached an altitude of 7,315 meters on the Mazeno Ridge. However, once again, he did not make it to the summit. Having spent all their money on the expedition, they were forced to sell their gear just to buy tickets home. By 2015, Marek decided he was done with the mountains, but Tomasz had no intention of giving up. When Marek left, Tomasz decided he would climb alone, in alpine-style fast, with minimal gear, without setting up many camps, and most often without supplemental oxygen. This is a very dangerous style of climbing, one that leaves no room for error. After going solo, Tomasz met climber Elisabeth Revol, a rising star on the French national climbing team. Elisabeth was 5 years younger than Tomasz, and, in many ways, his complete opposite. He was talkative, eccentric, almost anarchic. She was a quiet physical education teacher from a small town. He was a former drug addict. She avoided alcohol and gluten. But as they say, opposites attract. As a child, Elisabeth practiced gymnastics, and when she turned 19, her parents suggested that she try rock climbing. In 2006, she joined a French expedition to the Bolivian Andes and returned with 9 summits, 5 first ascents, and a reputation as a highly promising mountaineer. In 2008, Elisabeth traveled to Pakistan. There, she summited 3 8,000-meter peaks: Broad Peak, Gasherbrum 1, and Gasherbrum 2. She climbed all of them without supplemental oxygen and in just 16 days. In April of 2009, Elisabeth set out for Annapurna with her Czech partner, Martin Minarek. They reached the eastern summit, but were unable to make it to the main summit due to hurricane-force winds. During the descent, Martin went missing, and his body has never been found. Elisabeth made it back down to base camp severely frostbitten and completely exhausted. She was given first aid and evacuated to a hospital in Kathmandu. The loss of her partner hit Elisabeth hard, and she left the mountains for 4 years. However, in 2013, she decided to return to the Himalayas, choosing Nanga Parbat for her climb. That year, she did not reach the summit, but she came back 2 years later and teamed up with Tomasz for a winter ascent attempt. This is how she remembers it. "I really enjoyed our climb together. We talked a lot and had a great time." That year, they reached an altitude of 7,800 meters. They joined forces again for another winter attempt in 2016, but bad weather forced them to turn back. This was already Tomasz's 6th attempt to make a winter ascent. Before leaving, he told a Polish journalist that it would be his final attempt and that he would not return to Nanga Parbat again. but on February 26, 2016, Simone Moro, Alex Chikon, and Muhammad Ali Sadpara became the first climbers to summit Nanga Parbat in winter. The record Tomasz had dreamed of achieving was lost. What's more, Tomasz even tried to challenge their record, demanding more summit photos and GPS data. But the record was officially recognized, even though the Pole never accepted it. That's when he turned to Elizabeth and said he wanted to try one more time. He told her that he felt bound to this mountain and had to settle things with it once and for all, and that he was certain this attempt would succeed. They arrived at base camp on December 23, 2017. For Tomasz, it was his 7th attempt. For Elizabeth, her 4th. On January 21st, they broke camp before sunrise and headed toward the summit. The ascent was painfully slow, and soon there was only about 1 hour of daylight left before sunset. But the climbers had still not reached the summit, and they had no intention of turning back. They had to finish what they had started. With every passing second, the shadows of the Himalayan peaks grew longer, casting darkness over the valleys below and making the air so cold that every breath became painful. Elizabeth Revol, a 38-year-old French mountaineer with 4 8,000ers to her name, took a few photos before the final push to the summit. For a moment, the frame lingered on her partner, Tomasz Mackiewicz, who had been obsessed with Nanga Parbat for 10 years. He had never attempted to climb any other 8,000er returning to this one peak again and again. On that day, Tomasz was moving more slowly than usual. After taking a few photos, Elizabeth Revol put her camera away, pulled out her GPS device, and realized she had only about 100 vertical meters left to become the first woman to summit Nanga Parbat in winter. The weather was calm. There was almost no wind, and for such an altitude, it felt relatively warm. But everything would change once the sun went down, and the climbers knew it perfectly well. The wind would strengthen, and temperatures would drop to minus 50 degrees Celsius. They needed to move quickly. She waited for Tomasz, and together they continued toward the summit. Later, Elizabeth would tell a Polish television channel that they reached the summit of 8,126 meters in the twilight of that day. She became the first woman to complete a winter ascent of Nanga Parbat, and Tomasz became the first Polish climber to do so. Not as widely celebrated, but still a record. Once on the summit, they took a few photos, but there was no time to enjoy their success. Tomasz looked extremely exhausted. Elizabeth asked him how he was feeling, and he replied that he could not see. She knew that blindness is one of the symptoms of acute mountain sickness, and that Tomasz was most likely developing cerebral edema, which would lead to his death if he was not brought down urgently to a lower altitude where he could get more oxygen, since they had climbed without supplemental oxygen in alpine style. However, he had already spent all his strength on the ascent. On the way down, Tomasz moved slower and slower. Elizabeth put his arm over her shoulder and began to lead her blind partner down the mountain. When they reached an altitude of 7,895 meters, just below the so-called death zone, Tomasz began to have severe breathing problems. When Elizabeth removed his mask, she saw bright red blood flowing from his mouth, while his nose and cheeks had turned white from frostbite. This bleeding was also most likely a sign of altitude sickness that had already led to pulmonary edema. The climber needed to be brought down urgently. At 11 o'clock at night, Elizabeth took out her InReach satellite device and sent a text message to 3 people: her husband, Tomasz's wife, and a friend. She asked them to arrange helicopters to help them descend. Friends and family began searching for helicopters in Pakistan. As you can imagine, this was a difficult task, especially since helicopters rarely fly above 6,000 meters, and they were far higher than that. At that time, Elizabeth helped Tomasz descend as low as possible, to an altitude of 7,300 meters, where she dug a snow cave to shelter them from the wind. From inside the cave, she sent another message. This was its content. Tomasz is in terrible condition. He cannot move on his own. We have no way to pitch a tent. He needs to be evacuated urgently. And by coincidence, on a nearby peak, a Polish expedition was attempting a winter first ascent of K2 under the leadership of the legendary Polish mountaineer Krzysztof Wielicki. This 68-year-old climber had all 14 8,000ers in his record, as well as a solo, oxygen-free ascent of Nanga Parbat in 1996. Here is how he later recalled the situation. I understood that the only option for Elizabeth and Tomasz was to send a rescue team from our expedition to Nanga Parbat and go up to help them. I asked 13 climbers in the K2 base camp whether anyone was willing to interrupt their climb to save 2 dying climbers. And every single one said yes. For this rescue operation, Wielicki selected Adam Bilecki, Denis Urubko, Piotr Tomala, and Jarosław Botor. At the same time, the helicopters were significantly delayed. Some say this happened due to a dispute over costs between the Polish embassy, France, the Pakistani army, and the climbers' insurance company. In the end, the helicopters had to be paid for by the families of the injured climbers. They finally arrived at K2 base camp at 1 o'clock in the afternoon on January 27th, picked up the 4 rescuers, and headed toward Nanga Parbat in search of the mountain. Even finding a place to land was not easy. The pilots had never been there before. So when we got closer, I showed them where the village was, where base camp was, and where they could land. I also told them they looked like brave men and asked them, if possible, to try to drop us as high up the slope as they could. The helicopters dropped the rescuers at an altitude of 4,800 meters. That is just below the first camp. Going any higher was not safe, so the climbers continued on foot. By the way, I often see people asking in the comments why they don't just use helicopters for rescue. The answer is simple. Helicopters physically cannot safely operate at such altitudes. The climbers decided that Tomala and Botor would stay at the landing site to prepare a camp, while Bilecki and Urubko would continue the ascent to reach the injured climbers. They began their climb at 5:30 p.m., and it must be said, these are among the strongest mountaineers of the modern era. 34-year-old Adam Bilecki had already climbed Mount Khan Tengri at the age of 17, and 45-year-old Denis Urubko had 19 8,000er ascents to his name. The climbers were in a huge hurry and completed almost the entire route without belaying. Throughout the ascent, they did not use a single ice screw. When they encountered ropes, old ropes left behind by other expeditions, they used them, although this is also very dangerous, since you can never know how reliable such a rope is. I want to remind you that this was a winter ascent of one of the most difficult 8,000ers. But it seems the climbers were very well prepared and, most importantly, properly acclimatized on K2. That's why they were moving at a very fast pace. Bilecki and Urubko did not know exactly where Tomasz and Elizabeth were, whether they were still in a snow cave, descending together, or had already separated and were going down individually. Here is how Denis Urubko recalls it. I started shouting, hoping that maybe a miracle had happened and they were there. I kept shouting through the wind, and finally, I heard a faint voice. It was Elizabeth. The climber had suffered frostbite and was struggling with altitude sickness, and she was alone. Tomasz was nowhere to be found, and before she was found by the two Polish climbers, she was hallucinating. That is also a symptom of altitude sickness. Elizabeth thought someone had brought her tea, and the woman she imagined asked her, in exchange, to give up her boot. At that moment, I automatically stood up, took off my shoe, and gave it to her. And in the morning, when I woke up, I was only wearing socks, the climber later recalled. The climbers gave her hot tea, tried to warm her frostbitten hands, and, of course, asked about Tomasz. Elizabeth said that he could not move or descend on his own, so she had been forced to leave him in a crevasse in their improvised camp. And at that moment, Urubko and Bielecki were faced with a very difficult decision. Try to reach Tomasz or bring Elizabeth down. Here is what Bielecki says. We understood that if we left Elizabeth and went for Tomasz, she would die. And even if we reached Tomasz and he was somehow still alive, we would not be able to bring a person who cannot walk on their own down from Nanga Parbat. The climbers made a very difficult decision. They would not go for Tomasz and would leave him to die in the mountains. At dawn, Bielecki, Urubko, and Elizabeth began their descent. The woman had severe frostbite on her hands and could barely stand. So it is more accurate to say she was being carried down. At 11:30 a.m., roughly 18 hours after arriving on Nanga Parbat, Bielecki, Urubko, and the injured Elizabeth reached the helicopters. A French politician asked President Emmanuel Macron to award the rescue team the Legion of Honor, France's highest civilian distinction. But the rescuers declined, even though they had truly performed a heroic feat. Here is what Adam Bielecki said about it. I don't think we did anything extraordinary. Anyone would have done the same in our place. Helping others is the duty of every climber and the duty of every man. The climber Elizabeth Revol suffered severe frostbite, but survived. Tomasz Mackiewicz left behind a wife and 3 children, and he himself remained forever on the slopes of Nanga Parbat, the mountain he ultimately did conquer. It's impossible, because someone always has to pay the price for it. Share everything you think about this story in the comments. Don't forget to leave a like on this video. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already.
Kochani, pokazać kto tu rządzi. To niestety, ale jest to niemożliwe, ponieważ wiadomo kto tu rządzi.